Well, welcome everybody to our third in a series of 4 conversations that stem from our film, Flannery. My name is Mark Bosco. I'm one of the co-producers of the film here with Elizabeth Coffman, and we're delighted to have our guest with us today to talk about Flannery and disability. I really welcome everyone's participation. We have a chat room, so if you would like to, write something down or ask a question, give us your name, and we'll be checking that during the conversation. Please be respectful as you can, and we're really excited to to have this conversation. We did one on race. We've done Flannery and faith, and now this is Flannery and disability. So I first want to introduce our conversation partners. Tim Basselin is an assistant professor of media, arts, and worship at Dallas Theological Seminary, teaching such interesting courses as theology at Sundance Film Festival on the one hand, which I love, and C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and their imaginary worlds on the other. But Tim really caught my eye, at least I think our eye, because of his book called Flannery O'Connor, Writing a Theology of Disabled Humanity, published by Baylor Press in 2013. I have to admit that I had heard of that work, but had never read it, and I just bought it a few days ago, last Friday actually, so I'm waiting for it to come. Until now, that book's been on the periphery, but I'm going to use it in my course, I think, with Flannery this fall. And we also have with us John Deane. He's joining us all the way from Ireland, late in the evening over there. John is a poet and novelist with several award-winning collections of poems. And he's had artistic residencies in Germany, Monaco, France, and over here in the United States, he's had residencies at Boston College and Loyola University, Chicago. I first met John when he was asked to be the plenary speaker at the Flannery O'Connor International Conference in Dublin some years ago, where I had to say he gave one of the most moving talks that I've ever encountered at an academic conference. I still think about it. He talked about his wife, Barbara, dying of lupus at the age of 37, and about his daughter, who was, I think, around 40 years old now, still living with lupus. So suffering, loss, and the search for transcendence preoccupies John's poetry, something that he shares a lot with Flannery O'Connor in that regard. So Tim and John, thank you very much for joining us. And of course, we always have Elizabeth Coffman, my co-producer, the lovely Elizabeth, who in many ways is responsible for the shape and the aesthetic of this award-winning film we did. So thank you, Elizabeth. We're really glad to be here. So to start it off, I thought I'd just say to ask, especially our guests, if there was a story that you love or that you return to that somehow engages your imagination around disability, what would it be and why? Why that story? Why that character? Anybody want to go first?
I'll have a shot if that's okay. Yeah, I think my name under what I'm looking at myself is Ursula. Is that coming up with you?
Yes. You're on your wife's.
Yes, I'm on my wife's Zoom. So I'm not actually Ursula. My name is John, and Ursula is my wife. But my first wife died at the age of 37, and I was extremely lucky to meet Ursula later. When I think about Flannery and disability, my feeling, first of all, is that she almost dismissed her own disability. She accepted it as a good old-fashioned Catholic would accept such a disability. And for me, the disability that she really focused on and concentrated on from there on was the spiritual, the internal disability. And for that reason, I have been excited by the word that Cyril O'Regan uses. The word is misremembering. And he has a book called The Anatomy of Misremembering. And as far as I can understand it, he means a deliberate forgetting of unpleasant things. And one of the stories that is not often commented on, and I don't think it's mentioned in your film, is a late encounter with the enemy.
Yeah.
Now, I like that story enormously. It's for me, it's a definition of perfect short story. It starts and ends perfectly. And General Sash is one of the most ludicrous and ridiculous and hilarious characters that I think I've ever come across. He's 104 years of age. He calls himself a general. He is absolutely and completely full of himself because he was dressed up once upon a time as a general and went on stage. So he has forgotten deliberately, I think, everything in his life, except the fact that he was once feted among beautiful girls on stage. Now his granddaughter is upset because she's worried that he might die before he presents himself behind her on stage when she's being presented with her degree. The story is misremembering that's the disability that General Sash has. And he is confronted with that much later on. And this is where the hole in the head happens, and his past actually comes back to haunt him. I also always like to think about Flannery disability and then all the strange characters that she comes up with who have the enemy within, if you like, and how they find redemption.
Yeah.
General Sash doesn't really find redemption. And we're very worried about the daughter at the end, that she may not find redemption either.
Yeah.
So for me, the enemy within is the great disability that Flannery develops. And I also, from my own experience, associate that with her lupus, her systemic lupus that she, I think, became aware of far earlier than we accept.
Yeah.
So for me, that is just a supremely funny story and also very deeply serious.
That's great, John.
Mark and I were both laughing because we have a section that will be an outtake from the film, because I also love that story, A Late Encounter with the Enemy.
Good.
I grew up in the South where watching Gone with the Wind was like a religious tradition, and also equally hated it. Flannery hated it, and so it's a great story. So we actually do have
story.
an outtake.
Oh, good.
With
Good.
that. But I'll go ahead, and the story I would pick is Good Country People, which is in the film, and I would pick it for two reasons. One, Holger, there's distinctly someone who's got a wooden leg, and two, it really deals with gender and attractiveness and romantic interactions, and how that kind of difference of being differently abled, of having a wooden leg, how it can affect the romantic interaction in really hilarious, painful, interesting. It's one of my favorite stories of hers by far, and so that's the first one I think connect to with her disability.
Well, and I think that we find out from Eric Lanker in the film too, that disability was one of the shocking things about him. I don't think he realized just how sick she was, right? Until that kiss, and it all came forward. So bringing all that together in the film was great too. Thanks.
Yeah. I almost picked A Temple of the Holy Ghost, which y'all do a lovely job with in the film, and thank you for the film. It's just really wonderful. But I had to go with her second novel, The Violent Bear It Away, where she uses a lot of tropes that she uses in other places. So you have Raber, who is the intellectualist, the modernist, like Holga or like Shepard is. But what deeply moves me about that book is how she embodies in Raber's son, Bishop, the one they call the idiot son, which I suppose is probably on the spectrum or something. I think she gives us the fullest expression of good in Bishop than she gives us anywhere else in her work. There's nowhere else that she talks about love as profoundly, because Raber absolutely hates his own son, Bishop. And at one place he even says that in 100 years, people will know enough to put people like Bishop to sleep before they're born, which is a really profound thing to consider. This was before Roe v. Wade, and you consider the way prenatal testing is done now. And yet, despite this hatred, Raber also has this just inexplicable love that he has to hold at bay, that he's afraid of. The novel calls it a horrifying love, and it's powerful enough to throw him to the ground with in immediate praise. If I could read I wrote down one of the paragraphs, if y'all wouldn't mind me reading that, because
of the novel, sure.
Yeah, because this is just so incredible. Raber was not afraid of love in general. He knew the value of it and how it could be used. He had seen it transform in cases where nothing else had worked, such as with his poor sister. None of this had the least bearing on his situation. The love that would overcome him was of a different order entirely. It was the kind that could not be used for the child's improvement or his own. It was love without reason, love for something futureless, love that appeared to exist only to be itself, imperious and all demanding, the kind that would cause him to make a fool of himself in an instant. And it only began with Bishop. It began with Bishop, and then it, like an avalanche, covered everything his reason hated. And I love that last line, that everything his reason hated, because O'Connor's primary, I think, enemy, part of what John was getting at, is the Enlightenment's faith in reason, as we can do everything ourselves and we don't need something outside of ourselves.
The fact that we couldn't get to the violent bear it away in the film is one of the the great, it's not an oversight, it's such an incredible book that you just can't mention it quickly and then move on. I mean, this is why there needs to be another film. Right?
Yes.
You know, I really think Bishop for me too. I mean, because it is the existential kind of, it's the symbol, it's the metaphor for Flannery in many ways in that character. But so I was thinking, I'm interested in the fact that either she has deformed characters that are emblematic of their own inner deformity, or she has deformed characters or disabled characters who really know, and it's their disability that allows them to see the world accurately, right? So you have you have Holga and say Mr. Shiflett, who it's kind of, you know, their own disability is also the disability in their heart or in their soul. But then you have people like Rufus Johnson, right? Or even the misfit in A Good Man Is Hard to Find, who he's crazy, and Rufus has this club foot, but they know they're so authentically aware of something bigger than themselves, as you say to them.
Especially Rufus.
Yes, especially Rufus. That they're the vehicles actually of grace, even though they're awful people, right? But they can be, because they know they have that kind of wise blood, you might even say.
Right, wise blood has it too.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's what I love Rufus for that. I love teaching about Rufus, and I love that Mr. Shiflett. And I'd like to kind of oppose those. One is about an inner disability that's now with a man without an arm, and then there's of course Rufus, whose disability allows him to see the world accurately. Yeah.
One of our, let's see, Kristen Lee in our chat on Facebook says, she points out that the Bible salesman is a kind of collector of disability in Good Country People with his false eyeballs and contraband.
Yeah.
So that's a great point. Yeah.
That's a really good point. I love it. I love it. You know, John, we've been talking about lupus, and I was wondering if you could kind of just talk a little bit about your experience with lupus in your life, with the loss, something with your wife, and just a little bit about that, because I think, do people really know what lupus is and things? And I thought we could talk about it, but you could really give us the experience of it.
Yeah. People will have experience of arthritis, the extreme pain that arthritis can bring, and rheumatism. And it is very often lupus is often not diagnosed properly. Yeah. And it's called rheumatoid arthritis, but it has all the symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis. The very important word, I think, in the context of what my Barbara had and what Flannery had, was the S part of SLE, systemic. lupus, which means that in fact it goes right through your entire system, and that is physical and the brain. It attacks the brain. It attacks any part of the body at any time, and is extreme in every part of the body, every possible part of the body. So the only sort of cure that they have for it, it's not a cure, it's a holding pattern, is cortisone. Now, cortisone has the steroid qualities, and prolonged use of that will soften the bones, as they did in Flannery's case and in Barbara's case, and now in my daughter Catherine's case. The other thing is that I think it is often brought on by an extreme event, a trauma. And I've been wondering why it took Flannery so long to manifest the lupus. It was, I think, after she came back from Yaddo, if I'm right. After she fell in love, as far as I can see, with Robert Lowell. And Lowell had a breakdown in Yaddo. And so everybody is communist. There were communists under the bed all over the place in Yaddo. You have this in the film, which is superb film, I have to say. And I think when she came back on the train, as she was coming back from Yaddo on the train, this trauma of the communism, and she had lost Robert Lowell as a Christian, she thought, and as a Catholic. And I think the manifestation of the lupus came about then, though it wasn't until several years later that Sally Fitzgerald actually told her that it was lupus, but she did suspect it. For me, it's a frightening thing. The phone will ring from Catherine now, she's 40. And every time that phone rings in my home, I think, oh, she's in hospital again. Any small traumatic thing will set it off again. The other problem with it is and this is quite up to date. President Trump recently announced that such and such a tablet will cure COVID, right? And he named the tablet. It has another easier name, which is called Plaquenil. Catherine has been on that for maybe 15 years. It helps rheumatoid arthritis. It also damages other parts of the body. Now, Catherine has been taken off Plaquenil, and her eyesight is beginning to go. The same kind of thing happened with Flannery all the time. They were trying to balance up the steroids with the lupus, and it's nearly an impossible thing to do. So you have to stay on a particular tablet. You must get the levels of that right. If you don't, you're going to have all sorts of extreme pain happening. In the interview with that strange guy who's smoking the cigarette at the beginning with
Harvey Bright,
and Flannery looks swollen. Her face looks swollen there, and she doesn't speak clearly, and so on. I think that might be the steroids that were damaging her at that stage. This is my experience of it. It's frightening, and it's permanent, and it can happen anytime. It can happen under severe sunshine. So maybe I think you also said it in the movie that she was afraid of the sunshine. She couldn't go out into the sun.
Right.
She would stay in under the trees.
Right. And she had to wear broad hats. That's right. You know, John, we did. I'm going to just ask Elizabeth, do you want to share your screen, Elizabeth? And we found some early pictures that no one had seen right after she just was her first terrible bout with lupus. These are some photos. I think most of them made it into the film, but I just thought we would show the group that this is her.
That one is in the movie. Yeah.
That one's in the movie. Yeah. I don't know if there's any other. Is that it? Okay. There were a couple others, but maybe that's enough. But
Well, there are several ones with her crutches, of course.
Yes, yes. And that was, of course, caused by the bones in her body's deteriorating as well.
The bones deteriorate, yeah. So that a person with lupus will fall very, very easily, and a hip will break, or a wrist will break. Anything like that can happen. Yeah,
well, in some ways, Flannery, although she died of lupus, she really died of all the consequences of taking so many drugs to fight. Yes. And so that's also part of it, yeah. But it also attacks a lot of the parts of the body. So kidney failure can be one of them. Various ulcers and tumors. And she has a very funny thing at one stage where she says, I have this terrible tumor, and they're either going to have to take me out of it, or no, take the tumor out and leave me, or just keep the tumor and get rid of me. Yeah. So she never complained. This is another wonderful thing about Flannery. She does not complain anywhere that I have seen or heard. Yeah. She never says, why me? And I think this is to do with the strength of her faith. Yeah. Sorry, I'm hugging this a little bit too much, maybe, but strange. Another strange thing about it is that when Barbara, my wife, was diagnosed with this, and the terrifying thing, the doctors told me it is not passed on. So don't worry. Her children will not have this. And then, so it took us quite a long time to diagnose Catherine's problem, because you said, no, you can't. It can't be lupus. It must be something else. But now they will admit, yes, you can inherit it.
Well, so our heart goes out to you, John, and your family for this.
Thank you. But
I was going to add, you pointed out that trauma often triggers lupus, and one thing that Mark and I found when we were at Emory, and that's where we found these photographs that haven't been shared before of O'Connor after she was diagnosed. But we also found some notebooks where she was writing about arthritis when she was, what, Mark, like 17?
17, yep.
Yeah.
17 years old.
But this would have been just after her father died. And that's in the film, I mean, we set it up that way deliberately, that narratively, it was just the loss of her father from lupus was, emotionally such a huge trauma for her. And it was not long after that she actually did start experiencing arthritic
That's right.
symptoms.
That's right.
Yeah. Hey,
Robert Lowell would have been something else too.
Tim, I want to ask you, maybe if we could just, obviously we know that O'Connor's use of disability, her own experience of lupus, it's always going to have a theological frame, right? Flannery can't help herself but to put things in cosmic, metaphysical, almost transcendent kinds of categories. I was wondering, you've done some work on disability studies with Flannery O'Connor. What's your take on all of that? Could you just maybe lead us down a bit of a conversation on that?
Oh, goodness. Like you said, I wrote a dissertation on it. So there's so many ways to think about it or go at it. So I've got a couple that I'd try to bring up, and maybe they will be starting points for a conversation, not really. But I think I want to point out that today is the anniversary of her death.
Yes, I meant to say it.
It's very appropriate that we're talking about her disability today. I think that an introduction to a memoir of Mary Ann that she wrote is the best thing that you can read on this. So far beyond anything I could say, like, don't get my book, go and read that article, and you'll have a much deeper understanding of how she viewed disability. And if she says in there that the purpose of the Christian life is to fashion one's death in Christ. And that's been a phrase that has just stuck with me for a long time. And if the purpose of our life, our Christian life, is to fashion our death, then an illness or a disability isn't just an obstacle or something for us to overcome. as it tends to be seen by the medical model, if you're familiar with disability studies, or then kind of the Enlightenment understanding of disability is it's something for us to fix or to overcome. But that a disability can actually be something that shapes us to be more like Christ. That's at least possible. It's not necessary, of course. I don't think that makes disability a good in and of itself. I don't think O'Connor would call lupus good. She would more likely call it evil, or maybe just neutral. But I think the key for her is that, ever since the Enlightenment in a Western society, we've believed in the perfectibility of humanity by our own efforts. And so in that Enlightenment vision, whatever we consider to be suffering, we try to eliminate it. And we believe that we're able to, we can figure out, if we can just, get enough scientific method put on it, we can figure it out and eliminate it. So in contrast to that, O'Connor wrote that evil is not a problem to be solved, but it's a mystery to be endured. It's a very, very different approach to how you would, your reaction to disability in your own life. Let me try to put it in a couple of different ways, and then we can talk about it. So for a modern Enlightenment perspective, I think our potential as humans lies in the absence of limitations. And whenever I think about this, I kind of imagine a banner in a hallway of an elementary school that says, "Nothing can stop you. You can be anything you want to be," which I've seen a lot of those kind of banners in my kids' elementary schools. But for O'Connor, I think our potential as humans lies not in the absence of limitations, but in our movement through limitation. And I don't know what that banner would look like in an elementary school. Maybe something like, "Difficult things will shape you the most." Yay! I think another way to talk about it in just more straight theological terms is that the desire for that absence of limitation, the Enlightenment model, is very anti-incarnational, because Christ took on limitations to enter into our world. But in our Enlightenment kind of understanding, or really just in our Garden of Eden selves, we want to be free of limitations. Yeah. And as Christians, we have a tendency to desire the resurrection without the willingness to go to the cross and participate in the sufferings of Christ. Yeah. And in contrast to that, O'Connor's perspective of moving into or through limitation is thoroughly incarnational. Yeah. Christ's willingness to take on flesh, to learn obedience through suffering, as Hebrews puts it, to accept the "not my will, but yours be done." That is the cross. In her essay, one last second, in her essay, The Regional Writer, she refers to limitation as a gateway to reality. And when we move through limitations, we're somehow mysteriously participating in the sufferings of Christ for the redemption of the world. And I don't understand that, but I think that's part of the depth of the mystery that O'Connor invites us into.
And I think she lived daily with this highly organized intellect around this issue. Yes. She understood her faith intellectually, and she understood her craft and her art as a kind of a gift to kind of embody that and flesh that, you might say, on these stories that can be read completely from a secular perspective, but also has that aura of mystery around them, which really comes out of that religious tradition, I think. Yeah.
And did she not willingly accept her illness? She didn't want to go to Lourdes, for instance. Yeah. She did not want a miracle. She wanted to accept what she had. Her knowledge of original sin, or her awareness of original sin, that we are all born flawed, as if we are all born with unwise blood. And what we need is a Christianity without Christ, so that we can get away without the redemption side of things, without having to suffer the cross. And I know she also wrote somewhere, she said towards the end, "I can, with one eye squinted, take it all as a blessing. So I think she did see her lupus as a kind of a gift, in a very old-fashioned Roman Catholic way, Mark. You accept pain and suffering, and you invite it even, so that you can be redeemed through suffering.
I know, Elizabeth, that's one of your favorite lines of Flannery O'Connor.
Yes, I did. I kind of wanted it as a title for a while.
We almost made that the title of the film. One Eye Squinted, you know.
Oh, One Eye Squinted, yeah.
I was just going to add the thought that, you know, again, from sort of a secular perspective, she, at that time when she was traveling and speaking in many places and trying to be a nationally, internationally known writer, she knew that she needed to travel, but travel was not easy. You know, this is before disabilities laws that were making things accessible for people like Flannery, and who had, you know, who could use elevators or escalators. So the challenges, she, like you were saying, John, she never complained. She never, you know, even in her letters, she always makes sort of facetious jokes about anything that slows her down. She never personally seemed to feel sorry for herself in what she wrote.
So I want to ask something about this. You know, the sense of disability, the sense of her characters. I mean, we use that, a literary term, the grotesque, right? The Southern grotesque, whatever you want. But this idea of the grotesque as an aesthetic kind of strategy. And I was really taken with how, through both photos, but also through our animations, we were trying to kind of find that place. And I think we did it best, perhaps, in the almost overly cartoon, A Good Man Is Hard to Find, right? The kind of, there was something about that. And I was just wondering what you all thought about, how does the grotesque then as a kind of image become, in many ways, the literary equivalent to disability? Am I pushing a little, maybe too far out there? I don't know.
Can you restate just the last sentence a little differently?
Yeah. So I'm wondering how, you know, Flannery was kind of it's talking about, you know, she uses the grotesque, the Southern grotesque, as if she's looking for freaks and things like that all the time. But in some ways, it's also considered part of the South. It's also it takes the place of a kind of a theological language about our own displacement, our own deformities, interior. And I'm just wondering what you thought of that as a kind of as a placeholder in some ways. So I was thinking about our film trying to figure out how to use the grotesque as a metaphor for disability.
He's wondering about the animations and the illustrations, and if the visual exaggerations in the animation have any kind of connection to the grotesque, perhaps.
Yeah, I don't think O'Connor would like anything exaggerated or, I'm just kidding. she said she uses large and startling figures.
Yeah, nothing startling, right?
Within disability studies and thinking from a disability perspective, it becomes problematic, obviously, to equate grotesque with disability. And so I had to try to do a lot of thinking to sort of separate those out and to try to make connections between and part of the way I did that was to go through her critique of the Enlightenment as this overarching bigger theme and understanding, and that her characters with disability, and I believe because of her disability, she had a particular insight in the same way that Rufus just completely rejects Shepard's sentimentalizing sentimentality of him. You know, you all may be familiar with that story of when she goes to Davison's and the woman gets into the elevator with her. She's at and the woman, you know, whispers in her ear very loudly, because, you know, if somebody has a disability, you're not sure what all is wrong with them, so you do all, you know. Anyway, she whispers very loudly that the lame will enter first into heaven. And O'Connor's so uncomfortable that she gets off on the wrong floor. And within the next year, she writes "The lame shall enter first." So kind of, and she is that Rufus character that is rejecting Shepard's sentimentality, that just completely misses the whole point, which is the tragic ending of the story, right?
Right. Wow.
Hey, Tim, someone on Facebook was interested in the article you were talking about. I think you may have been speaking from your book.
Oh, no, it was.
Oh no, it's Flannery, wasn't it? It was.
Yeah, it's Flannery. It's an introduction to a memoir of Mary Ann.
It's the very last chapter of Mystery and Manners.
Yeah,
Mystery and Manners.
And in one of her letters, she said that any critic that wants to say something about my work is going to have to read everything I've written, especially the Mary Ann piece. And yet you don't see it referred to very often.
Well, she claims she stands with Hawthorne, doesn't she? I mean,
yeah,
there's a real.
She looks at his short story, The Birthmark.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's really, really excellent.
Fascinating.
And in that, she says she tells how she came to a new understanding of her own work, which it kind of boils down to this sentence that the good is grotesque as well. I'm not saying that sentence well. Let me. Yeah. But maybe I wrote it down somewhere, and I'll give it to you in a second. Yeah. Oh, the face of the good is grotesque too. Right. Just we tend to think of evil as being grotesque, but she says the face of the good is grotesque too.
I think it was your friend Christina Weaver Lake who called that the good under construction. She kind of rephrases it actually in her work, that the good in us is always under construction. It's never perfected, but it's always reformed, reconstructed, and stuff like that. And O'Connor's all of her stories do that, don't they? They come to that point. They come to the point where, okay, now are you going to change? You get it. Are you going to reconstruct the good in you? You know, depending if what character it is, it goes different ways in each story. But wow, very true.
I wonder if we can reference a couple of moments from the chat. The great Rosemary McGee wrote.
Oh yes.
From Emory Library, and the Flannery O'Connor writer, scholar herself. She wrote, mentioned that in Higher Mathematics, the journal that Mark, you and I were reading at Emory, she mentioned she had aches and pains at an early age, which is true. Then someone else, Laura Soriat, has asked, would O'Connor have written and produced what she did had she not been confined in time and space by her suffering? Hard to know, but maybe we would have a very different author, if at all. How did being differently abled shape her as a writer?
Well, O'Connor said over and over again that her having to move back to Georgia made her the writer that she was, and the sort of concentration and focus that she had to have, and that she couldn't go and travel, and that she couldn't even work in the afternoons. She had to be so extremely focused, and it's part of what makes her the regional writer she is, but also the type of writer she is. And she freely admitted that in multiple places. So,
and it goes kind of back to what John said. John, when he was talking about the sense of this absence, this need to create the space, to feel that space of absence so that she could do her work too, right? I mean, that's, in some ways, it's her trying to almost make a monastic life out of herself. Yeah.
Well, I think we would all know that there is nothing like an extreme of either joy or of pain, of suffering, to make you stop and think.
Right.
Most of us just float through our days. Then somebody comes and gives you a big gift that you're totally unexpected, and life suddenly becomes wonderful, and you start isn't this just great? Isn't life wonderful? And then you get you fall down the stairs, and your head's cut open, and you say, oh my God, isn't life terrible? She had, and I've noticed it both with Barbara and with Catherine, the concentration that they bring to the rest of life is very, very strong, much stronger than I think anybody else has. Okay, you get up in the morning and you take tablets and you try and get rid of the pain that has increased overnight. And then you settle down because you're slightly fresher in the morning, and you do your work. And I think by the time it comes to lunchtime, Flannery would be finished. She'd be flat out. She wouldn't be able to do anymore. So there is nothing like pain that to clarify the mind. And that brings me back to the wonderful thing about, well, Flannery is so many wonderful things, about her sense of humor. I find that just to be outstanding. Even in the darkest moments, there is a bit of fun. Like, isn't it Revelation where this is the hog lady? Am I right? Yes, it was the warthog lady.
Yeah, yes.
And she ends by saying, "Who do you think you are?" to God. And I think that is one of the funniest lines in the whole of literature. It's magnificent.
Right.
And
exactly.
so you either accept the pain and suffering and you try and face it with a bit of humor, or you whine about it and you become a miserable wretch.
Right before that line in that story, she references Job.
Yeah.
Talking about Job's suffering. And it's the same question at the end of Job. Right.
Yeah.
And then she yells that, and then it echoes back, and it comes back to her.
It's so hilarious because it's as if she's Job, the way Job suffered. She had a book hit at her head, and the girl strangled her, who was put back in the hospital. I mean, so the humor is even more there. But my favorite line of the film, which was from the letter when she's talking about going to Lourdes, and she says, you know, I'm a person who'd rather die for my faith than take a bath for it. Yeah. And there's this sense of, you know, those one-liners about the fact that, you know, she's going to Lourdes, she's going to go into these healing waters, and she's not doing it, as you said before, John, because she wants to. She's doing it for her relatives and her mother, but that she's got that turn of phrase always that just kind of, it's like it opens up things, and you see something revealed about this amazing artist in those little quotes.
Yes.
Wow. We're just looking over. Elizabeth? Are you looking over the chat? I just want to make sure we're catching things.
Let's see. We have a new question from Gibbons Burke, who's asking, how did the Catholic understanding of suffering help O'Connor with her personal difficulties, and how did it manifest in her work? So it's a Catholic.
It's a big question. That's a big question, and maybe I'll start. But John, maybe you, John, really, you alluded to it, that in the Roman Catholic spiritual tradition, suffering, participating with Christ on the cross, doing the stations of the cross, was a kind of habitual way for you to understand how you connected with God. You connected to God not so much through in his triumph, but Christ on the cross. And so you can make meaning. Suffering was a place to make meaning, transcendent meaning at all times. Even more so maybe before, even in the last 50 years, but certainly even today, the great spiritual masters, even that are around today in the Catholic tradition, suffering is the point where you touch transcendence. And it's a God who has suffered, and that's the God who somehow gets you in touch with your own humanity as well as divinity. John, take it away. Anything else you want to say about that?
Well, it's a huge question that goes to the heart of everything. The extreme person that started me really thinking, I think, was Simone Weil, whose entire thought was that you must make yourself nothing. You get rid of everything in life so that you become nothing, and that therefore God can come in and take over. You empty yourself completely. So this notion of self-emptying, which is, I think, becoming very popular nowadays, and things like centering prayer and all of these practices, is, I think, the way that God is supposed to be able to come in and take over. Teilhard de Chardin, one of my greatest heroes of all time, great footballer. From Teilhard de Chardin, I have written here, she eventually learned a phrase for something Flannery already knew about: passive diminishment.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? The serene acceptance of whatever affliction comes that cannot be changed. And this is, we're born with original sin. We're born a mess. We get out of the mess in some form of redemption by unmessing ourselves, un-egoing, getting rid of the ego, which people like General Sash, people like Mrs. Turpin, this is the great task they have in life. Even the grandmother in
A Good Man Is Hard to Find, yeah.
Yes, and the misfit himself, all of these people were trying to get rid of the ego. No, they weren't trying to get rid of it, but they needed to. And I think this is the Catholic thing. You just empty yourself to be filled with God.
Yeah, yeah.
I think, oh, go ahead, Tim.
Well, speaking as a Protestant, this is, and teaching some of these stories to my students, this is one place where it's really challenging for a lot of Protestants, because a lot of Protestants want to think of Christ's work on the cross having accomplished and completely having done everything and it's over. And so we don't have to suffer. And there's a lot of ignoring of places where Paul says multiple times that we participate in Christ's suffering, or in one place it's to fulfill in my body the suffering of Christ.
Yes.
Again, I have no idea what that means. I can't comprehend that. And yet that's the sort of mystery, again, that O'Connor draws me into over and over again.
Yeah.
Wow.
She takes all this for granted. Well, it is just there in her writing. She writes out of this context, the Catholic context, which is being lost. I mean, the whole religious context is being lost. The terminology is being lost. So I think a lot of younger people nowadays will be mystified by all of that.
Good.
I'm mystified by it myself most of the time.
Although I would say even her readers who were Catholic back when she was writing it were pretty much already immersed in a kind of, Jesus and the church is this place of triumph and then of the redeemed, and so it was the complacent person of faith both, and so she was not writing for the pious ever in her own faith, and sometimes that language, John, got sentimentalized. That theology got sentimentalized in the Catholic Church.
Right. That's what I was going to add, Mark, because she read Heidegger, right? She loved Dostoevsky. She did not have a sentimental approach to suffering, right? Or herself. And the way in which, I mean, the name of our series is The Modern Consciousness. The way in which she, as a modernist, really, or even postmodernist, if you want to go there, deconstructs a kind of sentimentality towards, I mean, Tim, I think you're starting to get to that with an idea that the suffering on the cross, Christ died for us and done, taken care of. No, there are different ways of thinking that through and of living it, and also of having finally a sense of humor about it.
Yeah.
She had this incredible line that again, it stuck with me for 10 or 15 years now, and I don't know what to do with it. It was in a letter to Betty Hester. Betty wrote to her, I think kind of, on the side, and said she was frustrated and upset that she felt like the people that she was around, her family and stuff, didn't understand her and get her. And O'Connor wrote that was part of participating in the sufferings of Christ for the redemption of the world. And this was within a year before O'Connor died. I mean, she's in the throes of death. Right. And for her to write that about people not getting you, not understanding you, like, wow, there's something, and I don't understand that, and yet I can't let that go for some reason. Right. It just keeps drawing me back.
Yeah, I think, I think that O'Connor was so aware that there was this convergence within American culture post-World War II of a kind of laissez-faire triumphalism. We're good, everyone else was bad, we saved the world, and therefore everything is a success story. The man in the gray suit. And she saw that also colliding with Catholicism in America, kind of making it, finally post World War II into the conversation of what it meant to be America, and that what that did was in some ways deplete a kind of a Catholic outsiderness. She's always an outsider, right? She's always on the margins there, and on all of that, and so she writes really with a critique to American culture, and I think she's critiquing her own faith tradition. She's really kind of bringing it all together. She came at a moment that was just an exceptional moment, I think, in American history. And
I just wanted to add that we've talked about her outsider status too, and her walking with crutches. My partner Ted did the sound design, was cinematographer, and we actually really wanted to get the sound of her crutches, and Andalusia let us record using those crutches in the space where she was. Oh, wow. We really were trying to get that sense of what it was like for her at that time.
I was trying to find the Flannery O'Connor quote that I love about. She says, "What people don't realize is how much religion costs. They think faith is a big electric blanket, when of course it is the cross. It is much harder to believe than not to believe." And I just, again, someone suffering from lupus, and then having that faith tradition both together, I mean, it just kind of comes out so strongly in her art. So,
Elizabeth,
please
go ahead. Okay, you mentioned something earlier, Elizabeth. It might have been before we actually started broadcasting, but I'm wondering if you could or help us out a little bit with a feminine layer on top of some of that we're talking about, the suffering and that we're not just talking about disability. There's a lot of other stuff going on.
Right, sure. And that's when editing the Good Country People section, I mean, I really felt, and we had wonderful people like Mary Gordon comment as well on attractiveness and O'Connor's own sense of romantic possibilities for her with her physical challenges, and of knowing she wasn't like a model, and what that meant, and how those participated in her own commitment to her talent as a writer and what it meant. So, I spent a lot of time thinking about when she's disappointed in romance, she felt that it mattered to her, and she did. I think, again, I'm so impressed at how she let nothing sort of stand in her way, or she gave very few hints of having a broken heart or of feeling upset that she wasn't, an athlete or a model out there. So, again, bravo to her on this day of her death. I applaud her.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Amen. I think that might be a good way, especially thinking about this is the day of her passing, and due to her disability, to lupus. To our fans who are in our conversation right now on Facebook and on Zoom, John Deane has written some beautiful poetry on the effects of lupus on his own life, having lived with his own wife's passing and his daughter. And John, if you wouldn't mind, could we use that as a fitting way to perhaps remember Flannery the day that she died? Would you mind reading
Absolutely.
those lines?
Sure, it'd be wonderful. It's a poem set in Chestnut Hill in Boston. And I've arrived from Ireland late at night in a big house, empty house, old house, and it's snowing heavily, and there are snow plows outside, and I can't sleep. I'm feeling very, very lonely, and I begin to listen to Brahms' German Requiem, because I'm in that kind of mood. So this is what the poem goes on to say. I have been wondering about our blizzards of pain and agony. Lupus, for instance, the immune system's down and civil war along the blood. Prance of the alpha wolf, bone scaffolding showing through. I lay restless. My temporary home whispered to itself in house language, its wooden shifts of consonants, its growing vowels, when there came, oh Christ, a sudden rapping against the door. I listened. Again, rapping. Urgent. I crept down. Opened. I had to. Street door, screen door. And saw darkness out there, snow swirling, and a shape that formed and faded out of the skirl of white and grey. And she came, breathless, shaking snow from her hair and face, stomping her feet. She stood in the non-light of the hallway, and snow pooled around her shoes. She, dressed in white, reached to drop a gift, she said. One bright Christmas rose, Helleborus, white-petaled, dark green-leaved, across the hall stand. You? I whispered. You? She smiled. But we laid you down decades ago, I said, to rest. Isn't it good, she said, to hear the crunch under your feet of fresh snow? You are in body then? Soul and body, body and soul, no longer flawed. I passed where snow is a swarm of whitest butterflies, though I had been growing old with the wolves. And why? Why now? And how? I bring, she answered, gifts. Wolves, too. Wolves, she whispered. Wolves are the lambs of God. But our child, I tried. Our child is wrapped up tight in pain, God's ways. But be peaceful now, she said, softly as a brushing by of snow. Be peace-filled. It is late, my traveler. Live at peace in the rush of Arctic wind. We are all sunlight dimmed. We are all snowfall thawed. But our child, she was already moving towards the door, her head shaking. All flesh is snow, snow fox, snow pelt I have been with you, a lover, singing against the moon, a wolf, a lamb. The door, I felt the touch of pre-dawn frost, heard snow in its soft slide, its fistfuls from the trees. Wolves too, she said. Wolves are the lambs of God. Wait, I called, and reached for her, but she was gone suddenly, and there was nothing. I have questions, I have prayers. Silence only, and absence. I heard still the breathing of the snow, a car somewhere climbing a hill. I stood in darkness, stood perplexed as always. A snow plow passed, the steel blades scraping against the roads. Soon cars, roof-racked with snow, would shift like herds of caribou down the long parkway. The first faint light of a new day touched the window. I saw on the hall stand, fresh and beautiful, one hellebore, one Christmas rose. I closed my eyes against the dawn and heard again Brahms, Wie lieblich sind deine Wohnungen. How beautiful your dwellings, Lord. How beautiful.
Wow, beautiful. Oh gosh.
Yeah, lovely.
You should, I think, John, maybe we should, for those, lupus is often called the red wolf. And so the wolves that just get multiplied in your poem, oh my gosh, the wolf is the lamb of God. Wow. Really beautiful, really beautiful.
Thank you, thank you. In honor of Flannery, what is her Irish connection, by the way?
John, it was pretty strong, Irish on both sides. But we talked about that in Ireland, didn't we? Yeah, she was on one side, they were both Irish Catholic families that came over into Savannah, which was a Catholic enclave in Georgia. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But
so Flannery is a surname over here as well as a first name.
Flannery was her middle name, Mary Flannery, and
yes.
the name of the general. It was a member of a Civil War general, I think, in the family. I think it was so that she intersects. But well, listen, we have to depart, guys. I really appreciated this so much, John, especially for you. I think it's midnight now where you are. Thank you so much for staying up with us. Just to hear you read.
Well, I didn't even have a glass of whiskey by my side.
Hearing you read poetry anytime, day or night, wonderful. Tim,
people are commenting on the poem too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Love it.
Yeah, and Tim, thank you. And you know, if you can give me a copy of that poem, what you read, we can maybe even share it with some of our people on our Facebook page too, John. We'd love to have that poem. So we'll talk in a little bit. Tim, Elizabeth, John, thank you very much. Have a good night. Join us next week when we're going to talk about Flannery O'Connor and the art of her craft. We're going to look at it from different perspectives. We got Alice McDermott, who's going to talk about the writer and the writer's craft and what she thinks about Flannery O'Connor. We've also got Elizabeth and Ted and Miriam, who is our musical composer, to just talk about how did they kind of get into the vibe of Flannery O'Connor as they created the craft of this film. So it's going to be a wonderful conversation about Flannery and her craft and those who try to craft their lives, their work around her. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye now.